And it is time to get this thing started. What's happening, everybody? Hey, I want to say thanks to all of you who have showed up already. I've been watching the chat. We have plenty of people in here. Monday, long story. Won't get into that. But tonight I am joined by Nate Parker from N8sTech Services. Thanks for joining me on the stream, Nate. Can't even talk. You can tell how excited I am about this.
It's going to be a good show.
All right, so if you don't already know Nate, he is another technician who works on phones and tablets and computers and so forth. And why are we talking about conspiracy theories? Well, it just happened to pop up during one of our streams, and we said, you know what, this is interesting stuff. And, you know, considering the fact that this really is the month of 9/11, and it's been after 17 years, you know, there really still are a lot of unanswered questions. Huge loss of life, obviously, biggest attack on this country in history. And there's a lot of interesting information out there that has come to light that at a minimum needs to be discussed. So that's why Nate and I got together and thought this would be something good to talk about. So Nate, I want you to kind of, you know, give your take on the introduction of conspiracy theory and what got you interested in this and what we plan on talking about this evening.
So thanks, Mike, for having me. I appreciate it. I've been watching your show for a long time, and I love it. So this is fun. This is really fun to get to know you better. As far as conspiracy theories, first question is, what is a conspiracy theory, right? So if I'm gonna show my screen really fast here for just a second. So a conspiracy is as simple as a secret plot or plan by a group to do something unlawful or harmful, and also the action of plotting or conspiring. So the idea of a conspiracy is quite simple. It's you and me conspired to have this broadcast today. And then when you have a well, obviously not conspired in a bad way, but the conspiracy theory goes in giving the explanation of an event or situation that invokes a conspiracy. And so a true conspiracy theory is what happened on 9/11. So when we get the official story put out by the 9/11 Commission report, that is a theory. They don't have an actual know for factual what happened, so it's technically a conspiracy theory. So no matter how you believe it, whether you think 9/11 was an inside job or you think that it was perpetrated and happened exactly like we were told, no matter which one it is, you're believing in a conspiracy theory. I'm trying to figure out how to stop this screen sharing, Mike. I can't.
It's on the left-hand side there. Yeah, so, and this is one of the things that I believe there's a lot of, not misinformation, but a lot of people will hear the term conspiracy theory and they automatically have formed an opinion and put something into a specific category. And we have to keep reminding ourselves, you know, hopefully, for anyone who's been watching this channel for any length of time, I hope that I don't come off as a completely crazy person. I've talked to Nate and he seems to have all his facilities together and doesn't think that people are out to get him or anything like that. But at the same time, you know, we have seen throughout history that any conspiracy has always started out as a theory. So, you know, it's one thing to say that the earth is flat, and you'll have a lot of people say, you know, that we really have a lot of information that would lead us to believe otherwise, but we have more questionable things that fall into a certain category of, you know, being open to debate to a certain extent. So one of the things that I thought was interesting, and I believe that may have prompted me really to kind of get interested in the 9/11 conspiracy theories, because I had heard people talk about questioning it and, you know, seeing the coverage on TV and watching the buildings come down and things like that. There wasn't a lot of questions in my mind at that time. And then I stumbled upon something else, which I want to show you real quick. And if you haven't already heard about this, everyone, there was something called Operation Northwoods. Now, this is verified. The information has been officially released by the government. So there is no question as to whether or not this happened. And this is a proposed false flag operation against the Cuban government in 1962. And what happened was that the U.S., this is all declassified information now, the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. government proposed that the CIA or other U.S. government operatives commit acts of terrorism against American civilians and military targets. So this was a planned operation to create a false flag so that we could basically declare war on Cuba. Now, this was not, it was completely rejected by the Kennedy administration. It never ended up coming through and happening. But we have to keep this kind of thing in mind, because when we know that there's a potential for something like this to really actually happen and then possibly be covered up or blamed on someone else, it does not help to fight against this whole conspiracy theory idea, just based on the fact that this is a proven conspiracy. This is something that really happened. So Nate, you actually know someone who is pretty deeply involved with this entire movement to start a new investigation into 9/11.
Yeah, Richard. You talking about Richard?
Yeah, I'm talking about Richard, and obviously you know him better than I do. I've watched some of his, some of his interviews. He was on, I think it was National Geographic. He was on a documentary with Ed Asner. He's been on many podcasts, and he is an architect, I want to say out of San Francisco, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And they've got something like 3,000 people who are in the business of designing buildings, of inspecting structures, making sure that they'll hold up, figuring out what types of problems are going to be prone to, if they catch on fire, if they're impacted by something from the outside. And him, along with this entire organization of architects and engineers, has said that, hey, a lot of this stuff doesn't add up. Like, we don't see how this makes sense, at least the story that we're being given. So
Right.
That's how I really want to lead into. And again, I want to let everybody know that I don't think that I am, at this point in time, leaning heavily towards either side. I believe that there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I think that there's probably a bit of misinformation on either side of this argument. But this is stuff that you've studied a lot more closely than I have, and I'm really interested to see and hear what you have to say about it.
Groovy. So anybody who wants to do some Google searching, or anybody, I think Johnny Chang, you're the guy that puts like the tags and stuff in the chat sometimes for Mike, or whoever does that. The person that Mike is talking about, his name is Richard Gage, and he's the founder of AE 9/11 Truth, so Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And he literally is touring the world right now, exposing like just the questions, the big questions. It's like, hey, you told us that this happened, but that story doesn't explain these other things. And as an engineer, as an architect, he's got some pretty valid questions. So research Richard Gage, and yeah, he's a good guy. He lives up here in Idaho. I met him a handful of years ago, and he's a great guy. But he's worth looking at, because he asks some really good questions from the angle of high credibility, right? When someone comes in and asks grandma about TriStar, she's going to be like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. There's don't worry about it. But if she comes and asks a cell phone tech about TriStar, we can kind of explain it in more detail. So Richard, being an engineer or an architect, he has the ability, the understanding that we layman people don't. And he's a fun guy. He's a really great guy. And then just to start off, we're not here to be offensive. We're not here to challenge anybody. We're not right nor wrong. All we are is simply asking questions. So hopefully nobody gets offended. And if you are, then you're a snowflake and you should just unsubscribe now. So Mike, you led into the official story. So what is the official story? Do you have any idea? How fast can you tell me what the official 9/11 story is?
The official 9/11 story, if you really want to kind of look at the background of what happened, this all kind of goes all the way back to 1980, when we were pretty much helping to support Afghanistan fight against Russia, to get Russian troops out of Afghan. And we had a certain weapon. Everyone seems to be familiar with Osama bin Laden. He was involved, from the very beginning in the formation of Al-Qaeda. But also there's another guy named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and he was actually a student in the US at the time and was involved in this creation of a network of radical Islamists who wanted to basically do damage to the US. And as you know, back in the 90s, they made an attempt to destroy the World Trade Center. They were not successful. Somehow that operation fell through. And interestingly enough, I went to look at this guy's background a little more. And he was actually a student here in the US, and during his time at university, when this group of Muslims would go into prayer, a lot of the other students would go and steal their shoes because they would take off their shoes before they went inside of this building to pray. And the other students would take their shoes and throw them into this pond that they had outside in the college. So you guys would come out and they'd have no shoes. And, I'm sure that this fed into his hatred towards, America or the establishment or however it is that you want to look at it. But back in 1986, we provided, well, technically the CIA was providing something called Stinger missiles. And these are, you've seen them before, they're shoulder-held rocket-propelled grenades that they were able to use to fight against the Russian forces and to shoot down their helicopters, which was one of the biggest things that they were having problems fighting against. So, that kind of that was the point where the war started to turn the tide, and Russia eventually was expelled from Afghanistan. But this plan apparently, to go after basically by the radical Islamist movement. And I want to put that out there because there's obviously a big difference between radical Islam and someone who happens to be Muslim. And I certainly don't want anyone to think that I'm grouping those two things together. But there was definitely a movement against people who were non-Muslims, and the U.S. obviously was a big target at that point in time. So the crazy part of the story is that, to the best of my knowledge, it sounds like the funding for this operation, which we kind of ended up blaming on Osama bin Laden and then ultimately, I guess, Saddam Hussein somehow. I don't know how he came into the picture. But it seems like a lot of the information points to the funding coming from Saudi Arabia, which I have always been surprised about the relationship that we have with Middle Eastern countries. It seems like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and a couple others tend to be big exceptions to the general policy that we have in the United States in regards to that. But to get back to the topic, the story that I've been told is that funding came from Saudi Arabia to get these guys to come over to the U.S. to train to fly planes into the side of buildings. This happened. We obviously all saw it on the news. We were all glued in front of the TV, probably for weeks at a time. They grounded all the planes here. And after the whole thing happened, obviously this type of event will unify any group of people. When you feel like you're attacked, I mean, the patriotism was at an all-time high, right? Everybody said, wow, I'm an American and we need to retaliate. And we really don't care who, we just need to retaliate against someone. And, and that tends to happen a lot. It's a very knee-jerk type of reaction. And it's kind of a good thing that those people aren't always in charge, but it seems like some of them are sometimes. So so we invaded more than one place. We're still in Afghanistan, we're still in Iraq, and we probably will be for a long time. And the thinking behind the conspiracy theory, from what I've heard, is that this was used as another type of false flag to say, hey, look, these guys attacked us. There were several, there are lots of inconsistencies in what happened, but the main point was this could have been an inside job that was perpetrated by some government agency in order to build support behind a war or invasion of, whatever country we think was responsible for this terrorist attack, which to me is a contradiction, because terrorism and war are not the same thing. Terrorist tactics, you cannot have a war on terrorism. That would be like saying you're having a war on people shooting guns. That's not what you do. You declare war against a group of people. And, for that reason, it kind of gives a blanket, just a free pass to say that, hey, anybody who's not on our side is a terrorist. And if you don't hate terrorists, then obviously your patriotism comes into question. So nobody's going to say, well, no congressperson is going to say, I'm not going to sign the Patriot Act, because he's not going to, or he or she is not going to get elected again ever, no matter what's in that bill, right? So that is my understanding of the conspiracy theory, is that maybe it wasn't perpetrated by foreign terrorists.
Okay. So some of the facts of 9/11 were 19 mostly Saudi hijackers with box cutters, right? The little box cutters that you cut boxes open with, hijacked 4 airplanes, flew them wildly off course for multiple hours, didn't get intercepted by a single fighter jet in that entire time.
Because they were all unavailable out at sea somewhere. Is that correct?
Because they were all unavailable, running a simulation on how they would respond if airplanes were hijacked and flown into the World Trade Center. So this is an interesting point. There was a drill taking place real time while the real time attack was happening. And so there was a huge, massive confusion. But that's not part of the official story. The official story is the 19 Saudis hijacked with box cutters, destroyed 3 buildings in the World Trade Center complex with 2 airplanes, hit the Pentagon allegedly with the 3rd airplane, and then the 4th airplane allegedly was crash landed by patriotic passengers who flew it into the ground. All of that was being orchestrated by Osama bin Laden halfway around the world in a cave using a satellite phone and a laptop computer while on dialysis for failing kidneys. So he masterminded this amazing attack against the most powerful country in the nation and successfully hit all but one of his targets, perhaps, all while being, right, a satellite phone in a cave somewhere. And so people like me look at it and I go, I used to believe it. I did. I totally was like, I hate Osama, kill Osama, slap his mama, right? Like I remember saying that 20 or 17 years ago when it first happened. But the interesting thing about it, well, actually, I wanted to bring up terrorism and the Patriot Act really fast. The Patriot Act was pre-written before 9/11. It was ready to go, and it was signed into law within 90 days of 9/11 taking place. So this wasn't like something that they just threw together and said, okay, we're going to pass this. They already had it ready. They needed a reason to pass it. And that was when, right, they throw it in and say, vote on it so we can see it and know what it is. But yeah, the official story is a conspiracy theory that these 19 people with Osama conspired. Later on, we go find Osama. We allegedly take him out. There's no video. There's no evidence that happened. We take his body out to sea, dump it in the ocean without notifying anybody and say, oh, we killed him. He's gone. And then the SEAL team that was responsible for taking him out later had a mishap in their helicopter and all died, or a bunch of them died.
Right.
That's the official story.
That was the thing that I never understood is we have this guy who's, world enemy #1, supposedly, this high-tech operation, this covert op where we go in and they get him and they assassinate or they kill him or whatever, however you like to phrase that, and then immediately dispose of his body. I never understood that. That right there was probably the biggest thing about 9/11 that made me just say, wait a minute, is he still alive? Was he dead before they got there? Why would you dispose of his body at sea and then, that's it? Like,
unless they never got rid of him. Because, so the conspiracy is so big, right? This is where you can start getting into like some crazy stuff. If we try to keep it just on 9/11, Osama and who's the guy that we went after in Iraq? Totally having a blank.
Yeah,
Saddam Hussein, right? So Osama bin Laden allegedly attacks us, and yes, he is the #1. Like if you go back in time and you look at the top 10 most wanted people in the world, he was in the top 10 prior to 9/11. And then after, or not after, but anyway, so the U.S. government with all of our resources is looking for this guy, right? The most wanted person in the world, and they can't find him. All of their intelligence, all of everything that they have, they can't find him. But you got to remember that there was some off-the-wall reporter somewhere that managed to get a live interview with him in his own cave. And so it's like, well, wait a minute, all the resources of the US government can't get this guy, but this nobody reporter manages to get a face-to-face with him when the US military couldn't do it. So there's tons and tons of questions. I guess the real question is where do you want to start with the whole 9/11 being an inside job? Because we can talk about explosions in the building, we can talk about no airplanes. We can talk about the explosive debris that was left over in the dust. I mean, there's tons.
Yeah, and I think we should get into the actual planes flying into the tower parts pretty quick here. I will say, and again, I'm definitely going to play devil's advocate on this one because we want to look at both sides. And as far as getting an interview with Osama bin Laden, it's not difficult for me to imagine. I mean, El Chapo did an interview with Sean Penn. I could see a high profile, war criminal or otherwise saying, yes, I want the media to see that I'm alive and I want my supporters that, you know what I mean? So the reporter could have been driven in blindfolded around in circles, and there's a number of ways that could, for that particular point, I have to say I can understand how that would make sense. We see that happen a lot of times because people want to get their message out. They want to prove they're alive, for whatever other reasons, whether it's propaganda or not. But yes, the real interesting thing, I think, is the fact that we have this huge organization that's saying, hey, we construct buildings, we design them, we inspect them. Some of these guys are scientists, they're chemists, and they're saying this doesn't add up. Like something doesn't make sense about being able to bring down these huge buildings with, even a commercial airliner. So let's talk, you start with wherever you think is a good lead in to compelling argument, or at least, thought-provoking things when we talk about how these buildings came down, the dynamics behind it, the explosions, the fires, and so forth.
Okay. So allegedly, the airplanes that hit the trade centers, there were two, obviously, Tower 1, Tower 2. They fell after 1 to 2 hours of allegedly burning. And I'm a former firefighter, so I know the whole triangle of stuff and how, combustion and smoke and all the heat and everything needed in order for things to burn. And what happened on 9/11 was these airplanes allegedly come flying in. They break completely through the facade, right? Remember, that's like a foot thick steel. That isn't just like some chintzy little thing. You're talking about an aluminum airplane passing through multiple feet of very thick structural steel. And it literally cuts a hole through it with not one bit of airplane debris getting knocked back and falling down. That's pretty interesting because there's footage, you can see photographs of a jet engine from an airline lying on the street, and it's all covered in the dust. It's the aftermath of everything settling. And the engine that they photographed and say, look, there's the engine, there's the proof, that airplane hit the building. It turned out to be not from one of the aircraft that hit the buildings, that allegedly hit the buildings. It turned out to be made by a whole different manufacturer that has nothing to do with American Airlines and whatnot. And so that was kind of a big deal because people go, whoa, look, you conspiracy theorist, there's the engine. But when you look closely at the engine and the specifications on it based on the images and people take their time to do this kind of stuff, and it's pretty intriguing. But they're basically claiming that the engine was not one of those airplanes. And hey, let me just say something real fast. Anybody who's listening to this, when I'll try to say like keywords and phrases, you can Google search these and YouTube search them, and your mind will be blown at what you find. No airplanes on 9/11 is a pretty fascinating theory because there's really no real evidence that there were legitimate airplanes. They look more like CGI. Everything about them is CGI. And so the inside job aspect of it is almost as if these guys needed to get rid of those buildings. They were beginning to become condemned anyway, and they obviously wanted them down. But instead of taking them down, dismantling them the proper way, it would have been way too expensive. So it's much easier to blow them up if you have the ability. But there's some crazy stuff. But no airplanes on 9/11 is a really interesting subject when you look at all of the different things, because there's one piece of film that shows something coming in that is not an airplane. It looks like a sphere. It looks like almost like a UFO. It's like a bubble. And I've seen all the arguments on both sides, but the bottom line is whatever this thing is, it's coming in very fast. And it's coming in faster than airline pilots claim that a 747 can fly. So you got to remember that with architects and engineers, there's another one, airline pilots for 9/11 Truth. There's a whole bunch of different groups for 9/11 Truth, but the airplane came in too fast, at too steep of an angle, and banked too hard. And they say that physics on an aircraft that large could not allow that to happen. And still to this day, they've had many expert pilots attempt that particular maneuver in simulations, and nobody has yet to be able to do it successfully. But the official 9/11 story is that this guy who could barely fly a Cessna was able to corkscrew this aircraft in to get right at ground level and hit the Pentagon, like right in a very key area. And we can talk about the Pentagon here.
Okay. Yeah. That was going to be my next question. When you talk about the foreign air engine or whatever, so right. that would mean that, you know, let's say there really was an engine from a completely different airplane on the ground outside of the building, then that would have had to have been, you know, if it was not from the plane that struck the building, or if there was not a plane, you know, theoretically to hit the building, then someone would have had to have delivered that engine to the outside of the World Trade Center, right?
Right.
Which is okay. Now you mentioned that they needed to demolish these buildings anyways, or that they were planning to.
Well, so from what I've heard, and I haven't looked deeply into it, but the buildings were borderline being condemned because I believe they were built in the late 60s, and they were state of the art. Like, these buildings were state of the art. They were the strongest ever constructed, and it was the first time they had used a design like that. So they had this lattice work on the outside that monolithically pieced together, so that when it was all bolted and welded together, it was one unit. It would be the equivalent of like a screen on your screen door. Each one of those little intersections, and you can stab a hole through it, and it doesn't compromise the integrity of the screen. It now just has a hole in it. And then that was tied into the 47 steel columns that created the spinal cord, basically, for that building. And so it was one of the strongest buildings ever constructed. And it was designed specifically to withstand multiple airplane impacts. It was designed to withstand, I believe, a Category 5 hurricane even. They were tough. These buildings were extremely tough.
So why were they borderline being condemned?
Oh, I don't remember, but it had something to do with the asbestos and some of the previous stuff and the new laws that were coming.
Gotcha.
And so I don't remember all of the exact details on that, but I remember hearing that it's like there was a debate of, well, we can't really blow them up, but we can't really afford to tear them down. And so that's part of the conspiracy theory, is people say, look, those guys, they said it was a condemned building because of the asbestos and the fireproofing and all these different things. That was why they were renovating it as well, was to kind of shore up some of that stuff.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. For a minute, I was going to say, wait a minute, if they were going to be condemned, then that might lead to them being weaker. But you're saying asbestos is the main concern there, or something along those lines. Right.
Well, something else to think about, Mike, is how many other buildings have been hit by aircraft? Most of us would say, well, I don't know of any. But if you do your searches, you'll find that there's been several, including not the Sears Tower, the Empire State Building, I believe, was hit by a 707. And the interesting thing about that is that building is still intact and still there. It didn't crumble to dust and disappear. But when the airplane hit it and basically bounced off. It caused damage, and obviously some of the aircraft made it through windows and whatnot, but the majority of it kind of bounced off. It's like, you know, you getting hit in the head with a balsa wood airplane. It's going to kind of, you know, bug you, but it's not going to penetrate your head and make your body turn to dust.
Right. And what you mentioned, I really hadn't given this consideration before, but an airplane is pretty much a big hollow tube of aluminum. It's not like it's super thick steel, because if it was, it would be very difficult to get it off the ground, right?
Right.
So yeah, and buildings obviously have to withstand some pretty serious, you know, outer elements up to and including hurricanes and stuff like that. So it does seem strange that it not only penetrated, but I mean, it looks like it went halfway through the building when it hit. I mean, wasn't there windows coming out of the other side?
Right. If you look at really closely some of the footage, I don't know how what is allowed. If we can pull up video, I could very easily find it.
If it's on YouTube, we couldn't, because they would definitely not let that happen.
Okay, so anybody who's listening, do some YouTube searches on this type of stuff, because Mike, refresh me that last question you just asked.
Oh, so I was just saying that when in the videos that we saw, which I will say we saw a lot of the same videos over and over, but obviously how many cameras are going to be set up if there's some unexpected event like that? But it looked like the plane hit the building, and I don't really remember like debris coming out from the other side. So how far did the planes penetrate the buildings on impact?
Right. So if you think about, like, logically, when I imagine, okay, what would it look like? And if you could see it three-dimensionally in your mind, the airplane is going to be shredded like a carrot going through the facade, right? Because it had the narrow windows, it had the steel beams. And so this airplane going through it I'm totally losing my train of thought here. The airplane is going to be shredded on the way in. But there's video that shows the aircraft coming into the building. See if I can get my hand, aircraft coming in, and it disappears into the building, and you see the nose cone, I guess it'd be this way, you see the nose cone appear for just 1 or 2 frames on the other side of the building, and then the cameras fade to black, and then it comes back on, and then all you see is the fireball. But there are, from a few different angles, the nose cone of the aircraft looks like it penetrated. And that's why people say that there were no airplanes and that they were CGI, because they were doing the shots live. They were doing this all real time live, overlaying computer generated graphics. And so whatever the object was that was flying in, whether that was a missile or a UFO or whatever the object was, had an overlay. If there were no airplanes, right? I'm speaking from the conspiracy theorist side of you guys, so don't freak out on me. This aren't necessarily my beliefs. I'm just taking this position. But you can clearly see in the video that it goes through the building, and you see the intact nose cone on the other side. And then you can look at pictures of aircraft that hit a bird on the runway, and their nose cone is like deformed and mangled, and they can't fly it again until it's repaired. But yet you see a nose cone come through a steel facade, all of the office space, the interior core with 47 very thick steel columns through the other side of the office space, and then penetrating out the side before the fireball consumes it. That's odd. That's really odd to see that.
Yeah, it is. And I got to say, at the same time, it seems like quite a stretch to not assume that the official story, and the one that, we've been going with up till now, is that these 2 planes flew into the World Trade Center. I've got to imagine there were at least, considering how big, how populated that area is, there has to have been a lot of people who saw this happen, or nobody saw it happen. If the proposed argument is that there were no planes, I think that'd be a tough one to pull over unless everyone just said, yeah, nobody actually saw the impact. We only saw the aftermath. And right. I want to say it seems like a lot of people were, coming on TV and saying, yeah, I saw these planes. It looked like they were flying low. They hit the building. I know there's always you can pay people to say whatever you want them to for the most part, but it seems like that would be a tough one to pull off if that was really a hoax, that it never actually happened.
So how they did it, if that's how they did it, I haven't seen anybody who has true raw footage that wasn't first inspected by the government. So that's something else to keep in mind. You got to remember, the Pentagon is the most surveilled building that we have in the world. It has more CCTV cameras pointing away from it and at it than any other building. It's the most secure building that we have, especially in the United States. And there is not one single frame of footage that shows an airplane coming in and striking that building. And the testimony of the people that were surrounding it, the gas stations, the convenience stores, all of them who have security cameras, would have caught that from multiple angles. There should be a plethora of footage of an aircraft hitting the Pentagon. There is not one frame. And the testimony from the people on the ground were, hey, I was the guy running the gas station that day, and as soon as we didn't even know what was going on, but we had men identify themselves as CIA, they came in and they took all of our recordings and they deleted them. And that testimony happened several times. All of the footage that we get to see of all of the different impacts are either from media, so ABC, NBC, MSN, everybody that was recording that day. And then all of the amateur video that we see, if you go back and you research who those people are, they all have ties to media organizations or ties to government. And so we don't have anything, and I could be wrong, like, right, hear my heart, guys. If I'm wrong, show me. Don't attack me. Don't tell me I'm an idiot, but show me where this information exists, because I haven't found it. But nobody has their own raw data anymore. Even the French guys who did that 9/11 firefighter video, right, the one that accidentally caught the first impact, even they didn't know that they had captured the impact until after the government took their footage and then gave it back to them. And that was when they realized, hey, we caught the aircraft. And so even that one, the accidental mistakenly we captured it, isn't even really, like, it's just weird, right? There's a lot of anomalies that don't add up.
Yeah, I do remember the Pentagon being is right after 9/11. I remember hearing all sorts of stuff about the Pentagon and how there was no, they thought an object hit it, but they couldn't find the traces of the plane, and it looked more like it was a missile initially. And I do remember a lot of crazy stuff, and not actually having any footage. That does stick out in my mind.
Yeah. They were also running drills leading up to that. If you look at the Pentagon footage that went out live on TV, It doesn't match. The shadows are different, right? So anybody who does anything with video, especially video editing, you know that shadows have to match, especially when you're going to cut and paste and add layers and whatnot. The interesting stuff about the Pentagon footage is they were showing footage of an evacuation that had taken prior to that in some different drills that they were running. They showed that as live on 9/11, and the shadows and stuff didn't match up. And then they show real footage, and then they blend it with this other stuff, and they passed all of it off as live video when it wasn't all live video. And that's verifiable too by going back and looking through the video records of it.
That is pretty strange. Hey, I want to take just a quick turn here and say, well, what's up to everyone in the chat quickly. I know you guys have been here kind of listening in, and during these live stream interviews, it's a little hard to keep up with the comments, but hey, thanks everyone for joining us. We got Johnny Chang, Harvey, Sir O Nightfall, Carl Letourneau, Real World Review, who I can hardly say, but he will be joining me next week for another conspiracy theory live stream. I probably missed a couple people, hopefully not, but guys, thanks for showing up. I really appreciate it. I think there were a few questions and statements in here that were kind of interesting. One that I thought was funny, Harvey said, I think Trump was somehow involved. He did say after the buildings fell that his building was the tallest, and that seems totally in character for some reason. There's a lot of HD video with reenaction of the events that transpired that day that don't give warning. They are not actual footage from the day and people believing those to be the truth. And there's a lot of that going on in the news today. And like you just mentioned with the Pentagon evacuations. Also, if those terrorists just learned piloting a plane as complex as an airliner just by having flight school in a Cessna or flight simulator, it's very, oh boy, that is a new word to me, Johnny. Inverosimile. In any case, that's an interesting thing about this too. You know, these guys apparently supposedly the people who flew these planes went and got trained to fly planes and then never wanted to learn how to land them. And that didn't raise any red flags for anyone. We've also got information that says that some people believe that this being looked at as a terrorist attack, that various government agencies had information pretty much telling them that something like this was imminent. We knew that for a long time, terrorists had been targeting the Twin Towers, again, going all the way back to the 90s, not so much with the intent to cause massive loss of life, but more of a statement. You bring down the World Trade Center, you get everyone's attention. And I certainly don't have any trouble believing, their motivation for that, because it's so symbolic. And then, of course, targeting the Pentagon, and had they made it to the White House or something like that, would have been even bigger. One of the interesting things that you reminded me of that I kind of forgotten about was Larry Silverstein, or Stein, who is the owner of the buildings.
Yeah, the lease owner.
World Trade Center, and took out $3.2 billion, a $3.2 billion lease, and set up insurance policies on July 24th, 2001, shortly before the terrorist or the buildings came down. I'll say that. And to the tune of about a $7 billion profit, which is really a huge coincidence, right?
Well, he purchased the lease, I believe it was $100 million. Was what he purchased the lease for, and he controlled all buildings in the WTC complex. And yes, when those came down, he had his insurance policy specifically written to cover terrorist attacks. So it wasn't just a standard insurance policy. It's kind of like if you live in a flood zone, right? You get your homeowner's insurance, but it doesn't cover acts of God, right? Or a tsunami, they're not going to cover you. It was kind of the same thing. So Larry Silverstein put specifically in to cover acts of terrorism. And when the buildings came down, and he goes to get his insurance claim, they granted him whatever his, the 2.3 billion or whatever. And then he said, no, sorry, boys, I want that times 2, because there was 2 events that happened that day, 2 buildings.
Oh, right.
Events.
Okay.
And so he forced him to double the insurance. He became a billionaire by doing that.
Wow.
And one more thing, Google search insider trading on 9/11. Never in history has more put options been sold against an airline company ever in the history, until 2 or 3 days before 9/11. That they had the biggest sell-off ever. They're called put options when you're betting that the market's going to crash.
Right.
And more put options were sold 2 and 3 days before 9/11 than any other one in history, and that was a massive payoff for somebody. Somebody made billions of dollars on those put options.
And also, there was a thing I want to say. Hey, Oscar Zarza, I thought I saw you in the chat. I'm trying to find your comment. There he is. What's going on? Also, there was a thing about Donald Rumsfeld, I believe, stating that a bunch of money had just disappeared, like right before this, and apparently a lot of the information that they needed to investigate and figure out where that money went, destroyed in the demolition of these towers.
Well, it was in the Pentagon, actually. So
it was the Pentagon. Okay.
On September 10th, Donald Rumsfeld made an announcement to the media and said, "Hey, we're missing $2.3 trillion."
On September 10th, so the day before.
The day before, Donald Rumsfeld says, "Hey, we 2.3 trillion is missing from the government coffers, right? That's our money. That's you and me paid into that. 2.3 trillion missing." And it was being investigated in the section of the Pentagon that had recently been renovated to become bomb-proof windows and shatterproof, all this stuff. They renovated this building to strengthen it. And that was where the investigation was happening. And the guy doing the investigation was in that room, and that's exactly where the object impacted and destroyed that section of the building.
Wow.
So all of the evidence that happened that was going to track down that 2.3 trillion was all destroyed. I believe it was the following day, the 12th, when the Federal Reserve, which is a whole conspiracy by itself, they enacted their emergency powers, and over 6 months, they basically destroyed, I don't remember how many trillions of dollars worth of bonds and stuff that they were like, okay, all gone. They literally wiped it clean. And it's looked at by some people as one of the biggest heists in history. This was a financial heist. Forget the buildings, forget the people. This was one of the biggest exchanges of money that had ever taken place when you take into account the insider trading, the insurance policies, what was happening inside that was going on. And remember, the third building that fell that did not get hit by an airplane that most people don't even remember was Tower 7. It was the third tallest building in that complex. That one had all of the information on Enron. It had the CIA, the FBI headquarters. I mean, that building was a very important building. And it also fell at free fall speed without being hit by an airplane. And that shut down the investigations into all of that crime that had taken place with Enron and all of the other stuff that was going on at the time. All destroyed.
I want to say, on a related note, I also remember reading about funding aid that was going to, I want to say, Afghanistan. It could have been Iraq, to rebuild, where the only way that they could really transfer the money was with currency. So they were sending pallets of cash to provide aid, to rebuild after the war, or, mission accomplished, or whatever you want to call it. And apparently a lot of that money is missing also. And there's really no way to track it down because it's cash. I mean, if it disappears, it disappears. Yeah. There's no paper trail, which is bizarre, that's how we send money. Just here's a big pallet full of $100 bills, and, make sure it doesn't get lost.
Well, I think you're talking about what Obama did, right? In the last presidential term?
Probably.
Yeah, he kind of got there. Well, there's a lot of people that are questioning that and claiming that he basically paid off the people to shut up, because he literally did fly in pallets of cash. I mean, unprecedented. And then it's like, oh, don't know where it went.
Yeah,
like, you can accidentally lose a pallet of cash at my house. I'm okay.
Yeah, that's nuts. So let's talk about this, because we got about 15 or so left, depending on when we decide to end this stream. But one of the things, a couple of things I thought were interesting. One is that there is an organization that is called the National Institute of Standards and Technology, otherwise known as NIST, N-I-S-T. And they supposedly funded an investigation to about $16 million, looking into the causes and all of the details surrounding the World Trade Center. And the interesting thing about it was that they only investigated the floors where the impact took place. And this is the reason, apparently, one of the supporting reasons behind the architects and engineers pushing, and not to mention the families of the victims of 9/11 pushing to say, hey, we want an investigation into the entire building, not
Right.
just the floors where the plane hit, because if the plane hits the building and the floor catches on fire, we get that. But if the whole building comes down, we need to understand why that happened. And apparently NIST really never went into that.
No, not even a little bit. Their 16 million or whatever that number was shameful. They spent, I want to say, somewhere close to 10 times that on the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky scandal, right? And so there's a lot of people that say NIST was set up to fail. The 9/11 Commission report was intentionally set up to fail because it was underfunded. They didn't get the money that they need. They weren't allowed to investigate the way that a true investigator would. Even when Dick Cheney and George Bush testified, they didn't testify under normal conditions like you and I would have to do. They testified in private with no records, no recordings, no video. And they got to do it together. It was kind of similar to the Hillary Clinton email crap, where they get to do it together, and it's like this. We never do this, but why are we allowing it in this one? And so their testimony has never been released. We don't know what they know or don't know, but that's kind of scary that they were able to do that.
Yeah, well, it seems like we are trending towards people in certain positions not being prosecutable anymore. So
right,
I don't know where or when that ends, but I have a feeling we're going to find out pretty soon.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, and again, I do want to look at this from both angles. There was a private party. He's a nuclear chemist. His name is Dr. Frank Greening, and he was also initially a skeptic, about the details of 9/11. And he was very surprised as well that NIST never really went into a thorough investigation of both of the buildings. So he kind of took it upon himself to try to figure out what exactly happened. Does this make sense as far as the buildings coming down? Because as you mentioned earlier, the whole thing looked like a controlled demolition. When a building falls, if you don't engineer things properly, you can't really control where the pieces land. But when we watched the World Trade Center, it literally just pancaked. I mean, everything came down, straight down, didn't go off to the side for all practical purposes. The debris and the dust and everything obviously caused some problems, especially for the rescue teams and people who survived the initial fires and the explosions. But he decided that he was going to calculate whether the towers could actually collapse on their own without any explosives involved. And this is one of the things that I do remember in physics, is that you can only build a tower so high, because if you have enough weight on anything, eventually the foundation will literally melt because of all the pressure from the weight of the building. So there is a limit pretty much to how tall you can build towards the sky. When they say the sky's a limit, no, there really is a limit. You can't just keep going and going. So, with that in mind, we have to assume that any tower of substantial size and height like that has got to be pretty heavy. There's got to be a lot of weight behind it. There's rebar and there's concrete on every floor. And so what he did is he set up a computer program to simulate momentum transfer based on the impact from each floor to the next. So we have or we've been told, the story is that these planes crashed in, the entire floor caught on fire. Obviously, they had to have reached some pretty extreme temperatures when you've got jet fuel involved in the impact. So it's certainly not hard to believe that if a plane crashed in and got inside of the building, which I know that you have some issues with that part of this, but let's say they actually got inside the building, the fire breaks out. When one floor collapses, why would the whole building come down? That seems to be the thing that's really in question. And according to him, by running this computer program, he was able to determine that if one floor fell, then the weight above, and remember, it's not just the floor above, it's all of the floors on top of that. As you keep going up, you've got more and more weight. That would in fact cause a chain reaction similar to the ones that we saw when the buildings fell. And because the impacts are on different floors, the simulation would account for the difference in mass above each point of impact. The program actually predicted, but without him inputting the information, he built this computer simulation program and said, if there's a building this tall with this much weight of these dimensions, and a floor at this level and a floor at this level, because these were at two different areas on both of these buildings, right? One was on the 15th floor, one was on the 22nd. How long would it take the entire building to come down? And this program actually predicted, according to him, and choose to believe what you will, obviously, the program predicted that the North Tower, which was impacted at the 15th floor, would take roughly 13 seconds to hit the ground, and that the South Tower, which was impacted at the 22nd floor, would only take 11 because of the additional weight on top. And that is indeed, what happened. So I thought this was interesting because, again, we're looking at both sides of this. There's certainly questionable, missing details, and all anybody I think really wants to know is what really happened. But I'm surprised that more of this type of research isn't happening by independent parties.
I think there's a lot more happening than what you think. It just gets demonized. And, I've gone back and I've looked at some clips of newscasters and stuff, the weeks and months up after it happening, and the very first people going, hey, this doesn't make sense. And every single media source was like, you are an idiot. I don't even want to have you on my show. I can't believe that you think that, that this is an inside job. And they weren't even looking at any of the evidence that the people were presenting. All they did early on was just demonize and condemn them and criticize them. What I'm looking for, I'm kind of scanning through some photos, but there's an interesting piece of information about 9/11 that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me when I look at it. And this is kind of a new aspect of the theory that I only came across probably 6 months ago. And we all saw the same stuff, right? We got to see airplanes slam into a building. We got to see fires and smoke and fireballs. We got to see the second tower that hit fell first, and then the first tower that was hit fell second. And then I don't remember, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours later, tower number 7 fell. All of them fell in the same fashion. They all fell at free fall. But the really interesting thing to pay attention or to look at, and anybody who's Google searching images, Google search aerial footage of 9/11 after the dust settles. And there's a very interesting anomaly that you can see around the two towers, is there's holes in the ground. So we're talking about 110-story skyscrapers falling to the ground, and there are literally holes in the ground. And if you watch and you look in slow motion at the buildings as they're collapsing, there's a few really interesting things that you can see. One of them is symmetry. And so if this is the face of the tower, here, I'll turn my phone back. If this is the face of the tower and then you've got the other face going this way, the building was demolished from the top down. And if you look, there's two camera angles where they're down low and they're looking up at the buildings. And you see the buildings, you see them coming down at you. And there's this very symmetrical, because you see two sides, right? Two sides of a square. And it's very symmetrical. You see nothing happening on the beam, the support beam in the corner. But you see this very symmetrical push out of dust and debris happening on both sides equally as it's coming down. And I'm pretty sure if you could see all 4 building or corners at the same time, you'd see it. But it's a very symmetrical ejection of debris blowing out as this stuff is coming down. But when it's all said and done, there's holes in the ground. Where did all the concrete and steel go? So here's the Google search the tower coming down, guys, or Google search the towers vaporizing or whatever.
You can show an image if you want to, Nate. We just can't run video from YouTube.
I'm kind of looking for one. Anyway, there is an image, and I'll try to find it. But there's an image where the buildings come down, and there's a spire. There's something that stands up tall in this rubble, and it stands there for a few seconds, and then it looks like it stopped. It's like boom, everything stops, and then this thing starts to lean over like this, and it literally turns to dust before it falls. The steel, that was a steel column, and it literally, you can see it on the video, it literally appears to be turning to dust. And as it's falling like a tree, it just goes into a cloud and it's gone. And so there's a woman out there, I can't remember her name, but she is basically saying that they used exotic weaponry, some type of energy weapon or Tesla technology, and they turned the steel into dust, for lack of a better word. They literally vaporized the building. So whether there was explosives or not, I don't know. There are images. Guys, Google search explosives inside the Trade Center, right? And there's this guy, excuse my phone. You'll see some Saudi kids that are college students doing some stuff within the building. And there's this stuff, it's not BB-8, but it's like BB-12 or BB something, but it's basically a plastic explosive. And there's cases and cases and cases of this stuff in there with these guys that are, doing their little thing inside the infrastructure of the towers. And so people say, there's no evidence of bombs. There's photographs of people with plastic explosives in the building before the buildings were destroyed. So yes, there is evidence of that.
Okay, so since we're running towards the end here, ultimately my question is, if this was not, if these buildings were rigged somehow to demolish or to explode from the inside out, and it wasn't these planes, or it wasn't these planes alone that brought them down, and there really is a conspiracy here. There's something more to it than we know about. What's your take on the parties responsible and their motivations? If it's not, or is it, is it like plan B for the same guys who flew the planes into the building? What do you think?
I think I think it's a new world order type of a thing. So in order to truly take over, right? How many times has somebody tried to take over the world? It goes all the way back to Rome, right? So it's nothing new when you have people that want to kind of be in charge, right? So we have our modern day, we call it the New World Order. And if you Google search New World Order or what is New World Order, you'll find that it was George Bush Sr. was one of the first ones to really kind of talk about it and make it mainstream, because all the conspiracy theorists had been talking about it for a long time. But the goal, from what I can tell, is that they want to have a one world government and a one world religion. And the only way that that can happen is to, we have to destroy the sovereignty of the United States of America, because we're kind of unique. When we broke away from Britain, we had our War of Independence in 1776. We said no taxes without representation, go back home, and we became our own sovereign nation. Our founding fathers gave us, I shouldn't say gave us, because people can't give you what is inherently yours anyway. But we have the freedom, right? We can practice any religion. We can love anybody we want. We can kind of do whatever we want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. We can build a business, or we can be lazy, right? I mean, the Constitution and the founding fathers gave us a foundation so that we couldn't be taken over by a tyrant, which is the First Amendment, our right to bear arms, freedom of speech, and then right to bear arms, the number one and number two things. Those are really, really, really important, because if those get taken away, one or the other, then the second one will go very shortly behind it. When people don't have the ability to speak what's on your mind, could you imagine if what we were doing is illegal? Oh my gosh, we're talking about an inside job where we're saying that something nefarious happened and that we were lied to about it. Imagine if that was illegal. It is illegal in places like Korea. It is illegal in Japan. We don't have freedom of speech. America is unique. It's the only country that protects our freedom of speech. Everybody has freedom of speech. Nobody protects it with the Constitution like America does. And people say, well, Canada and blah, blah, blah. No, there's people in Canada that said stuff they weren't supposed to say, and they're sitting in prison for it. America is the only true vestige for freedom of speech. The reason we have freedom of speech and a right to bear arms is not to go hunting, is not to really defend our home. The right to bear arms is so that if we get a person in our government who is tyrannical, who wants to take over, we, the people, it's our responsibility under the Constitution to stand up with our arms and say, no, we're not going to go down this road. So why would 9/11 take place? It's because they're attempting to take away our right to free speech and our right to bear arms. Once they get those, we will fall. Every dictator in history who's ever wanted to take over, from Hitler to Stalin and Mao, they've all come after the guns first. They always do. Right? And they make it out to be all righteous, right? Like, oh, you're a good citizen if you just give up your guns. But then once the populace can no longer defend itself, you become subject of whoever's in control. And we've seen that through history. And that was why our founding fathers gave us the right to bear arms and not muskets, right? People argue, oh, it's about muskets. No, muskets were the weapons of the army and the weapons of the people. So if we take that thinking, we, the people, should have access to the same weaponry and same armaments and protection that our military would have, because that was equal back then. And there are people whose opinion is that we should be equal today. If someone has a rocket launcher, I don't care. Someone has a tank, I don't care. I mean, I'm in Idaho, right? Everybody carries guns, everybody, and then we don't have crime. We don't have problems here. But you go to a gun-free zone, and that's the #1 most deadly place in our country.
Okay, but there were no guns involved, as far as we know with this. They supposedly were box cutters.
Oh,
So
right.
I'm trying to see the connection there.
So my point is that they're going to use a terrorist attack like 9/11, right? You made that point a little bit earlier. You're like, well, how do we fight terrorism? It's an unending war. It's the war that has no enemy. It has no country. It has no group. It's just anybody, right? Even George Bush Jr. said it. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And so
he said a lot of silly things.
but he said it and he meant it, right? And he said it during wanting to go to war after this. And it was a way to divide people, because there were people that said, "Yeah, we don't want to do that." There's, it makes no sense that Saudi Arabia allegedly attacked us, right? Because most of the hijackers were Saudis. And then we go and we blow the heck out of Iraq. Like, that made no sense.
It doesn't, but if you bring George Bush or George W. Bush into the equation, it certainly does, because they wanted to assassinate his father, and he most certainly held a grudge because of that. But we're going to get off track on that one.
Sure.
What I'm really trying to understand here is that, how do you use? So you start a war against terrorism, and that becomes your premise for taking away the right to free speech and the right to bear arms.
Right.
Somehow.
So, so a false flag, Google search false flag, and you'll realize that the thing that you talked about, what was it? What was the one that you brought up this morning?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm going to bring it back up again.
Something with wood. Anyway,
the
one with Cuba. There was also the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So this has happened many times in our past, where they want to accomplish something, so they fake an event, and then they get something to happen. So Rosewood. Thank you.
No, yeah, I'm sorry.
Northwoods. Yes. And so we know that was true. So they had an agenda that they wanted to do. They wanted to get Cuba into war. And so they said, well, if we do this and we blame it on them, we can get away with that. And so by having something like 9/11 take place, now anybody who wants to keep their guns must be a terrorist, because you don't love America if you want to keep it, right? It's that weird mindset of right is wrong and wrong is right, up is down, boys or girls, right? It's that idea that if you think traditionally, there's something wrong with you. But a false flag is designed to make people want it, right? One of the things that they talk about, they, right, being they, the people that are behind it, is never let a good crisis go to waste, right? I believe Hillary Clinton said that, and there's some other people that have said similar. And so you have a crisis like Sandy Hook, right, which is a whole conspiracy by itself. But what was the first thing that happened after Sandy Hook? It takes less than 24 hours and people are saying gun control. We've got to have gun control. And it's not that good people used their guns to do bad things. It's that bad people used their guns to do bad things. And when you have attacks like 9/11, a false flag, where you put in the Patriot Act, right? The Patriot Act is scary when you really think about it. And then the stuff that came after it under the Obama administration with indefinite detention, suspending habeas corpus.
That's pretty insane to even realize that happened. A lot of people really aren't familiar with the details. It's pretty crazy, but you can be considered an enemy combatant and be locked up and without any due process, no trial, no lawyer. You're guilty until indefinitely. That's pretty crazy. That is part of the Constitution disappearing.
Yes, and so the goal is to erode and get rid of the Constitution. We can't have a one world government and a one world religion until we get rid of the Constitution. And look at what people are screaming for right now. We got to get rid of the Constitution. It's outdated. We don't need electoral college. We don't need, any of this stuff that we were founded on. And they want to go after free speech. It's hate speech. If you disagree with me, that's hate speech, Mike.
Was the electoral college part of the initial founding of this country, or was that something that was developed later on? Because I don't know my history that well, but I think that came into existence a little while later, if I remember.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. But the idea is, though, that things were founded way back then to prevent the things that are happening today from happening.
Right. Yeah. No, and I agree with you. And I'll tell you, Nate, just my personal take on it. I don't know about the one world order or the new world order and the one religion, one everything. but I'm certainly in agreement with you that all governments have a tendency to move towards more control over their populations, and events that would motivate people based on fear, which is the most powerful motivation there is. If you scare people, you can get them to give up anything, starting with their rights. So
exactly.
I'm right there with you on that one. And whether 9/11, to me, it would have, if you were trying to make a move against guns, you would have involved some guns in the attack. That would have made a lot more sense than hijacking airplanes.
Well, right. But and I throw that in because it's part of the Patriot Act. Remember, the Patriot Act was that's a scary document that did come after that. And they can't just have one guy come in. We're not just going to have one president that comes in and says, okay, this is what we're going to do. It has to be systematic, and they're building up to it. And that's why, magazines that exceed, 10 rounds are now illegal. If it has a pistol grip, it's now illegal. They're systematically chipping it away at it by using the Patriot Act, by using things like the 9/11 terror attacks and all of the other stuff that's happened since then. Anybody who thinks I'm crazy, research crisis actors, and you'll find that there's a company out there that does realistic. They have people that are amputees, they have people that are actors, basically, to go to these crisis situations to train guys, firefighters, EMT, police, first responders, and they put on these real simulations where you'll have, oh my God, a bomb just went off. And then the first responders go running in and they don't know what they're going to find, but they see a guy laying there with blood all over the place and his leg is laying next to him. And these are actors, right? And it's all part of the drill. But they do this in real life. So 9/11, there were crisis actors. In fact, the guy who's wearing the ball cap, who says, he's like, wow, yeah, first I watched one airplane hit, and then I watched the other one hit, and then I watched them come down, mostly due to structural failure because of the heat was just so intense. That's this guy's testimony on camera. Well, that guy now later was at one of these other false flags that just recently happened, the same guy giving the same type of testimony, firsthand witness. The guy was BS. He was total BS. He's an actor. And we see that all the time. The Boston Marathon bombing, the Sandy Hook shooting, and then the San Bernardino shooting all had the same woman interviewing as an eyewitness to all three of those events. And it's like, come on, lady, really? I've seen video where they take these actors and they interview them, they spin their camera around, the girl puts on a vest and takes off her glasses, and now she's being interviewed again as somebody different. Like, this is the stuff that they're perpetrating in our media right now. Fake news, buddy. It's fake news. But they are coming after our rights. I do believe that. They are coming to strip us away. And each of these events, they're getting closer and closer. And they admit they want a one world government. They admit it. That's not just conspiracy theory talk. They want one person to be in control.
Interesting. Well, it's certainly something we're talking about on a conspiracy live stream. Hey, we better sign off here. We made it. My ISP did not fail again. Thanks for everyone who joined us tonight. This has been a lot of fun. We really would just want to do something different here. Obviously, please, if you will, hit the like or hit the dislike button. If you didn't like this and you don't want to see more of it, I want to hear that too. Interestingly, I got a dislike on this video before it even started. So somebody didn't like the idea of this happening, but whatever.
Hey, a thumb is a thumb, Mike, whether it's up or down. A thumb
is true. That is entirely true. An interaction counts. So really, downvote is almost as good as an upvote, but obviously I feel better if I have more upvotes on there. Nate, thanks for taking time out of your day, man. I really appreciate it. You'll have to come back, and we'll definitely do a live stream about phone stuffs at some point in time, because I think that a couple people might have been getting a little antsy there. Like, hey, I thought this was a phone repair channel. I know that I saw that somewhere in the chat.
Yeah. Well, anybody who's listening, who's actually stuck around catching this on the replay or whatever, go through and research the points, because it's easy for a guy like me to get up here and say inside job and George Bush pushed the plunger to blow the buildings, right? It's easy for somebody to say that. It's a little bit more difficult for somebody to go and do their own research. I have spent at least 100, 200, 300 hours looking at YouTube videos of 9/11, reading the books, reading the stuff where they talk about some of the facts. And there is a tremendous amount of information that's available that discusses what happened. we didn't even talk about what was on the floors where the airplanes hit. That's an interesting one. Both floors where the alleged airplanes hit were both renovated leading up to it. The entire building had been going through floor by floor shutdowns leading up to it. There's a tremendous amount of information that point to an inside job. And yes, I'll just throw it out. George Bush had to have been in on it to some degree. Him and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, they're dirty people. From the 9/11 truther movement, they're dirty people because of the things that they have said and done that we can all look at. But there's a tremendous amount of evidence that looks terrible when you look at who renovated, who is in charge of security, what did the testimony of the people living or working in the building say? All of those little tiny things. And then Tower 7, which fell at free fall speed without being hit for no reason. Buildings don't do that. Those are good questions to seek answers for.
Yeah, for sure. And I encourage everyone to do the same thing. I don't like to actually, Harvey put a message in the chat. It says, Nate, do you work for Alex Jones? And it's funny because I swear to you all, this is completely coincidental that Alex Jones is going through whatever problems he is having. And I think I've said this before. I think he's kind of out there, and I think he knows the value of entertainment. He obviously stepped over the line in a few places, but when we have social media deciding, which, are privately held companies, they're not regulated. We don't have a right to tweet. We don't have a right to post on Facebook or upload to YouTube or anything like that. But when we start moderating heavily and censoring people from expressing their ideas, even if they're crazy ones,
right.
That's a scary thing to consider, especially because this is the way that a lot of us communicate. And this is a way that a lot of us get our information. And we need to be able to see all aspects and decide for ourselves. And when you start censoring people just because you don't agree with what they're saying, that doesn't lead anywhere good. Yeah. I hope that, if anything else, come away from this with an open mind to say, hey, I want to see the whole thing. If it starts off as a conspiracy theory and it sounds crazy, cool. I still want to hear what you have to say. And then I'll make the determination and, walk away and say, hey, Nate, you're out of your mind, or wow, you raised some good points there, and I never thought of it from this angle before. We need to be able to do that. Yeah. It is, like you said, it requires effort. That's the downside. People don't want to think.
And having an open mind is sometimes tough, because I went in. I look at tons and tons of different conspiracy theories, and some of them I've gone into going, this is just asinine, just a straight up asinine. But my question is always, why would somebody believe this? Why does Mike believe X, Y, and Z? And I go in and I look into it, and I'll tell you what, there are some conspiracy theories out there that when you just hear them, you're like, oh, you are dumb, dude. Don't even talk to me. But if you take the time to say, this is my problem, I say, why do you believe that? I'm not here to change my mind, but I just want to know, why do you believe it? What evidence do you have? And there have been several times where my mind has been blown, and I have to change my opinion, because it's like, yeah, I thought you were crazy, but there is no other explanation for that. Some stuff is just, it is,
Well, it probably makes a lot of sense, to understand the thought process of the people around you. What motivates people. If a lot of people are buying into something that you think is crazy, like you said, you want to know why do they believe that? Where's that coming from? And it's difficult to debate anyone if you're not familiar with the topic. Even if you want to defend your position, you need to understand where they're getting their information from and what gets them convinced of this crazy idea, whatever it may be.
Right. And sometimes educating yourself on the official story is enough to do that. So, like I said in the beginning, the official story is 19 hijackers with box cutters thwarted the most powerful military in the world, masterminded by a guy on a dialysis machine, a satellite phone, and a laptop in a cave halfway around the world. That's crazy. We have our air defense is state of the art. There is no way that we had 4 hijacked aircraft. Here's something that people can look into. How many minutes does it take from a hijacked aircraft being identified as hijacked? How many minutes until it is intercepted by a fighter? I believe the number is 10 minutes or less 100% of the time, except for on 9/11. They had 4 hijacked aircraft in the air at the same time, not one fighter intercepted over 2 hours. Never happened before. That's a pretty interesting fact. to go.
Yeah, I didn't know
well,
that. 2 hours?
yeah, it was something crazy. I don't remember the exact number. Don't hold me to it, but it was a long time. They were wildly off course. But they also, every single aircraft intersected on a map a military base at some point. All 4 of them all intercepted a single military base before impacting their targets. That's another interesting fact.
Pretty strange.
Was it Harvey or who was it that said about I work for Alex Jones?
Yeah, that was Harvey.
Harvey, buddy. No, I don't work for Alex Jones, and you're gonna dig this. Alex Jones is not Alex Jones. There's a whole conspiracy behind him. He is actually Bill Hicks, according to some people, because the real Alex Jones was replaced to become a gatekeeper. And so that's why Alex talks about, he gets in your face and he screams, 9/11 was an inside job. And, and he screams these absurdities, right? He does it because he's catching some people, he's waking up some people. But on the flip side, he's keeping the rest of us asleep. The people who believe Alex Jones is the truth, he's just the next level of keeping you in the dark. And yeah, I know who Alex Jones is. I subscribed to his stuff for a long time. And there was a long time when I just thought he was like, oh my God, this is the guy. He's giving us the truth. And then I realized very quickly, quickly, a year or so, that Alex Jones is a gatekeeper. He is one of them. This whole lawsuit with the Sandy Hook thing and whatever, in my opinion, I think it's a joke, because he's one of them. He's in on it. He is Bill Hicks. He is not who he says he is. And he has been masquerading as Alex Jones for nearly 2 decades, and he's not who he says he is. Go look into that conspiracy theory. He's here to keep us asleep.
All right. Well, if anyone has suggestions for more conspiracy theory discussion topics, or if you don't want to hear any more conspiracy theory topics, feel free to put them in the chat or put them in the video description. Add a comment to this video, and we'll see about doing this again in the future. Nate, I got to get off the stream here. So again, thank you so much, and I will talk to you again in the near future.
Indeed, Mike. I appreciate you, buddy. Thanks for having me on. This has been fun.
All right, everybody, have a good night. We will see you, hopefully, if things go as planned, Monday at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, as long as Comcast lets me get on here.
No more insulting Ajit Pai.
Yeah, I'll have to be careful on that one.